Do you remember seeing a photograph of a giant bird nailed to a barn wall? Its massive wings stretched wide, dwarfing the men standing beside it? If you do, you're not alone. Thousands of people across the world claim they've seen this photograph. They remember it vividly, with details so specific and consistent it defies coincidence. They describe Civil War-era clothing on the men posing proudly beside their kill. They recall the creature's enormous wingspan, perhaps 15 to 20 feet across, pinned brutally against weathered wooden planks. Some swear they saw it in a particular issue of National Geographic. Others insist it was in a book about cryptozoology they owned as children, or perhaps in an old Western history magazine their grandfather kept in the garage. The memories are powerful, tactile, real. But here's where the story turns unsettling. Despite countless hours of searching by dedicated researchers, despite the digital age making nearly every published photograph accessible, despite hundreds of people scouring their old books and magazines, no one can find it. The photograph has vanished. Not simply misplaced or rare, but seemingly erased from existence entirely, leaving behind only the ghost of collective memory. This is the mystery of the Thunderbird photograph, one of the most disturbing examples of what we now call the Mandela Effect, where shared memory insists on the existence of something that appears to have been deleted from reality itself. What follows is a journey into ancient legends and modern witnesses alike, all searching desperately for proof of what they know they saw. Mark Hall could feel it slipping away from him, this photograph that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. Throughout the 1960s and into the mid-1970s, the cryptozoologist had dedicated countless hours to tracking down what should have been a simple piece of evidence. A photograph. Just one photograph. But the deeper he dug, the stranger everything became. Hall had started his investigation with confidence. Multiple witnesses had contacted him independently, each one describing the same image with uncanny precision. A massive bird, dark wings spread impossibly wide, nailed to the side of a weathered barn. 6 men, sometimes they said 5, standing in a line beneath it, their faces small and distant against the creature's wingspan. The men wore what looked like Civil War-era clothing in some accounts, or perhaps just old, frontier garb. The details varied slightly, but the core image remained consistent. Too consistent. What troubled Hall most during those early years was the certainty these people exhibited. These weren't vague recollections or fuzzy memories. When he sat across from witnesses in their living rooms, watching them lean forward with intensity in their eyes, they described the photograph with the kind of detail reserved for images burned into memory. One woman in Ohio told him she could still see the grain of the barn wood. A man in Michigan described how one of the men in the photograph had his hand raised, as if pointing at something. A teacher from Pennsylvania remembered the bird's talons, how they seemed too large, almost grotesquely out of proportion. Hall documented everything meticulously. He filled notebooks with testimonies, cross-referenced dates and publications, wrote letters to magazine editors and newspaper archivists. His files grew thick with correspondence. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone was certain they could lead him to the photograph. And yet, every single lead dissolved into nothing. The pattern became maddening. Someone would write to Hall, absolutely convinced they had seen the image in a specific issue of a magazine. They would provide the publication name, the approximate year, sometimes even the month. Hall would track down that exact issue, sometimes traveling to university libraries or private collections to examine the original print edition. He would go through every page, every photograph, every illustration. Nothing. Nothing. The Thunderbird photograph was never there. But here is where the story turns from frustrating to genuinely unsettling. When Hall would contact these people again to tell them he had checked their source and found nothing, they did not waver. They did not second-guess themselves or admit to confusion. Instead, they became more insistent. They knew what they had seen. They remembered turning the page, and there it was. That impossible bird spread across the barn wall. Those men standing beneath it, looking up at the camera. Some became angry with Hall, as if he was gaslighting them, as if he had somehow removed the photograph himself. One man, a retired librarian from Illinois, swore he had seen the image in National Geographic sometime in the late 1940s or early 1950s. He had been a teenager, and the photograph had frightened him so badly He had nightmares about giant birds for weeks afterward. He remembered the caption mentioned Arizona or New Mexico. Hall obtained every issue of National Geographic from 1945 through 1955. He examined each one twice. The librarian's photograph did not exist. When Hall reported this, the librarian insisted Hall must have missed it, must have overlooked the page. He challenged Hall to send him the issues. Hall did. The librarian went through them himself and found nothing. His response letter to Hall was shaken, confused. He wrote that he felt as if he was losing his mind because he could still see that photograph in his memory, could still recall the feeling of the glossy magazine page under his teenage fingers. The Fate magazine leads proved equally fruitless. Multiple witnesses placed the photograph in Fate, the long-running publication dedicated to paranormal phenomena and unexplained mysteries. This made sense. If such a photograph existed, Fate would be exactly the kind of publication to feature it prominently. Researchers gave Hall specific issue numbers. They described the articles that surrounded it. Some remembered it being on the left page of a spread, others the right. Hall tracked down decades worth of Fate magazines. He contacted the editors directly. The photograph had never appeared in their pages. Then came the internet, and everything intensified exponentially. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, the search for the Thunderbird photograph found new life in forums and message boards dedicated to cryptozoology and unexplained phenomena. Suddenly, Hall's private investigation became a collective obsession shared by hundreds, then thousands of people. And the testimonies kept coming, wave after wave of them, each one describing the exact same image. The Reddit threads grew to hundreds of comments. People from different countries, different backgrounds, different age groups, all converging on identical details. The barn was always wooden, weathered gray or brown. The birds' wings always stretched wider than seemed possible. The men always stood in a neat line, sometimes holding rifles, always dwarfed by the creature above them. Many remembered the photograph as black and white, though some insisted it had been sepia-toned, or even in muted color. What emerged in these online discussions was a collective trauma, a shared sense of wrongness that went beyond simple frustration. These were not people casually misremembering something trivial. They were intelligent, articulate individuals who had begun to question their own sanity. Forum users compared notes obsessively, looking for the point where their memories diverged, trying to find the flaw in the collective recollection that would explain everything. They found none. One Reddit user, a woman who worked as a medical researcher, described her experience with methodical precision. She remembered seeing the photograph in a book about American mysteries in her middle school library in 1989. She remembered the book's blue cover, its placement on the shelf, the quiet of the library on a rainy afternoon. She had since visited that same library, now in her 40s, and tracked down what she believed was the same book. The photograph was not there. She had purchased her own copy of the book online. No photograph. She had contacted the author, who confirmed that no such image had ever been included in any edition of the book. Yet she could still close her eyes and see it clearly, that massive bird nailed to the barn, the men standing beneath it in their old-fashioned clothing. The forum discussions began to take on a desperate quality. Users traded increasingly elaborate theories. Perhaps the photograph had been deliberately suppressed by the government. Perhaps it had existed but was destroyed or lost in a fire. Perhaps it appeared in a publication so obscure that no one had yet managed to locate the right source. These rational explanations provided some comfort, however thin. But other explanations crept in, whispered in threads that grew long and winding in the small hours of the morning. What if the photograph existed in a reality that no longer exists? What if something had changed, some fundamental shift in the timeline or the fabric of memory itself? The Mandela Effect, they called it, this phenomenon where large groups of people share identical false memories. But calling it false felt wrong, when the memories were so vivid, so specific, so universally consistent. Researchers developed elaborate search grids, dividing up publications and archives among volunteers, systematically examining every possible source. They created databases of witness testimonies, looking for patterns that might reveal the truth. They enhanced old microfilm, combed through newspaper archives, contacted museums and historical societies across the American West. Every search came up empty. Every lead terminated in nothing. One particularly devoted searcher, a man who ran a cryptozoology blog, claimed in 2007 that he had finally found it. He posted that he had located the photograph in an old scrapbook purchased at an estate sale in Tombstone, Arizona. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. People waited eagerly for him to scan and share the image. Days passed, then a sheepish update appeared. He had been so certain, so absolutely sure, but when he looked at the scrapbook again, really looked at it, the photograph showed something else entirely. A large bird, yes, but clearly a stuffed specimen in a museum, not the image everyone remembered. He apologized for getting everyone's hopes up. He sounded shaken. The dead ends accumulate like evidence of something fundamentally broken. Each promising lead that dissolves into nothing adds weight to a growing unease. These are not stupid people making simple mistakes. These are researchers, librarians, academics, people trained to evaluate sources and verify information. Yet they all describe seeing something that apparently does not exist and may have never existed. Mark Hall, now elderly, still receives occasional letters and emails about the photograph. He has long since stopped actively searching, but he's never stopped wondering. In interviews conducted in recent years, he speaks carefully about his decades-long investigation. He confirms the consistency of the testimonies. He confirms the exhaustive searches that yielded nothing. And he admits, with the careful honesty of a scientist confronting something that defies explanation, that he does not understand what is happening. The search continues today, though perhaps with less hope than before. New forums emerge, new generations discover the mystery, new witness testimonies arrive describing the same impossible image. And still, no one can produce the photograph. It exists in thousands of memories, described with identical details by people who have never met, yet it appears in no archive, no publication, no collection anywhere in the physical world. Something is wrong. Whether it is wrong with human memory, wrong with reality itself, or wrong in some way we do not yet have the language to describe, the Thunderbird photograph remains perfectly visible in the mind and completely absent from the world. And that absence, that void where something should be, grows more disturbing with each failed search, each dead end, each moment of recognition when someone new says, "Yes, I have seen it too. I remember it exactly." Long before European settlers carved their names into this continent's ancient forests, the indigenous peoples of North America spoke in hushed, reverent tones of the Thunderbird. This was not mere folklore whispered to frighten children around campfires. This was sacred knowledge, passed down through countless generations, etched into totem poles that stretched toward the heavens, woven into the very fabric of spiritual understanding. The creature they described was so massive, so utterly beyond the scale of natural birds, that its wing beats created the thunder that rolled across the plains and through the mountains. When it blinked, lightning split the sky. Among the Lakota people of the Great Plains, the Thunderbird was known as Wakinian, a being of such tremendous power that it existed in a realm between the physical and spiritual world. Lakota holy men would tell of how these creatures nested in the Black Hills, in places so remote that only the most foolhardy or spiritually prepared would dare venture near. The Wakinian were not simply large birds. They were manifestations of divine power, servants of the Great Spirit, tasked with maintaining the balance between earth and sky. When storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the Lakota knew the Thunderbirds were taking flight. The creatures were described as being so enormous that a single talon could pierce through a buffalo with the ease of an eagle catching a field mouse. The Ojibwe peoples of the Great Lakes region shared similar accounts, though their traditions added layers of complexity to the Thunderbird narrative. In Ojibwe cosmology, the Thunderbirds were locked in eternal battle with the great horned serpents of the underworld, the water panthers that lurked in the depths of lakes and rivers. This cosmic struggle between sky and water, between above and below, manifested in the violent summer storms that swept across the lakes. Ojibwe elders spoke of witnessing these battles, describing how the Thunderbirds would dive from roiling clouds to snatch serpents from the water, their titanic struggles causing waves that could capsize canoes and flood shoreline. Warriors who claimed to have seen the Thunderbirds up close reported wingspans so vast they blocked out the sun, creating an eclipse-like darkness as the creatures passed overhead. Moving westward to the Pacific Northwest, the Thunderbird took on even more elaborate significance among the coastal nations. The Kwakwaka'wakwa, Nuu-chah-nulth, and Tlingit peoples carved the Thunderbird's image into totem poles with wings spread wide, dominating the other animal spirits depicted below it. According to their oral histories, Thunderbirds nested in the mountain peaks that overlooked the ocean, and their preferred prey was nothing less than whale. Witnesses to these hunts described how a Thunderbird would descend from the clouds, talons extended, and pluck a gray whale from the Pacific as easily as a heron spearing a salmon. The whale's struggles as it was carried skyward created storms that fishermen learned to read as warnings. "Stay off the water when the Thunderbirds hunt," the elders warned, or risk being caught in the violence of their feeding. Across all these tribal traditions, one thread remained constant and deeply disturbing. Thunderbirds did not limit their predation to animals. Numerous legends spoke of humans being carried away, particularly those who ventured alone into wilderness areas or who somehow offended the great birds. A young hunter who boasted too loudly of his skills might find himself in the shadow of massive wings. A woman gathering berries too far from her village could vanish, leaving only the deep gouges of immense talons in the earth. These were not cautionary tales spun from imagination. The indigenous peoples of North America spoke of these events as historical fact, as real incidents that had shaped their cultural understanding of proper behavior and respect for the natural world's hidden powers. The cultural and spiritual weight of these accounts cannot be overstated. When European anthropologists began seriously documenting Native American traditions in the late 1800s, they consistently encountered Thunderbird stories, even from tribes that had no contact with each other for centuries. The consistency of the descriptions across thousands of miles and dozens of distinct cultures suggested something more than myth. These peoples were describing something they believed was real, something their ancestors had witnessed and survived, which makes what happened in Tombstone, Arizona, in April of 1890, all the more remarkable. The Tombstone Epitaph, a frontier newspaper known more for reporting silver strikes and gunfights than cryptozoological wonders, published an article that sent ripples through the American Southwest. According to the report, two cowboys riding through the desert between the Whetstone and Huachuca Mountains encountered a creature that defied comprehension. The thing they described had an enormous, elongated body covered in smooth skin rather than feathers, with wings that resembled bat wings more than any bird. But it was the size that captured attention. The cowboys claimed to have shot and killed the creature after a prolonged chase, and when they measured the wingspan, it stretched to 160 feet from tip to tip. The article described how the cowboys brought the creature back to town, where it was displayed and examined by numerous witnesses. The head was said to be approximately 8 feet long, with eyes as large as dinner plates, and a beak filled with sharp teeth, a detail that aligned eerily with some Native American descriptions of Thunderbirds, having characteristics of both birds and reptiles. The epitaph reported that photographs were taken of the creature before it was processed for its hide, and then, as mysteriously as it had appeared, the creature vanished from the historical record. The photographs were never found. The hide was never displayed. Skeptics would later claim the entire story was a frontier tall tale, the kind of sensational journalism common in the Ira.Dao Kai. But others noted that the epitaph was a serious newspaper, and the detail in the article suggested eyewitness accounts rather than pure fabrication. The Tombstone incident might have faded into complete obscurity, dismissed as 19th century fake news, except for one troubling detail. Sightings of enormous birds continued, and they were not confined to remote desert regions or the distant past. They persisted into the 20th century, with witnesses who had no knowledge of Thunderbird legends or frontier newspaper articles. On July 25, 1977, in Lawndale, Illinois, a warm summer evening turned into a nightmare that would traumatize a small Midwestern community. 10-year-old Marlon Lowe was playing hide-and-seek with friends in his backyard when two enormous birds appeared in the sky. Multiple witnesses, including Marlon's mother Ruth, watched in horror as the birds descended toward the playing children. These were not oversized hawks or eagles. Witnesses described birds with 6-foot-long bodies and wingspans approaching 12 feet or more, far larger than any known North American bird species. What happened next entered the realm of every parent's worst fears. One of the massive birds dropped from the sky and sank its talons into Marlon Lowe's shirt and shoulder. And then it lifted him. The boy's screams filled the evening air as the bird carried him 2 feet off the ground, flying toward a tree line at the edge of the property. Ruth Lowe ran after the bird carrying her son, screaming and waving her arms. Other witnesses joined the commotion, creating enough disturbance that the bird finally released its grip. Marlon fell to the ground, shaken but miraculously uninjured beyond talon scratches and the psychological trauma of being treated as prey by something that should not exist. The consistency of the witness statements was what made the Lawndale incident so credible. This was not a single confused observer, or a tale that grew with retelling. Multiple people, including parents, teachers, and neighbors, all reported seeing the same thing. 2 enormous black birds with white bands around their necks, curved beaks, and talons powerful enough to carry a 10-year-old child. The descriptions matched no known species. The largest birds native to Illinois are golden eagles, which have a maximum wingspan of about 7.5 feet and lack the size and strength to lift a human child, even briefly. Local authorities investigated but could offer no explanation. Ornithologists suggested the birds might have been turkey vultures, which are common in Illinois, but turkey vultures have a wingspan of only about 6 feet and lack the talon strength to grip and lift prey. Their feet are designed for walking on carrion, not hunting live animals. The witnesses rejected this explanation emphatically. What they had seen were predatory birds of extraordinary size, hunters that moved with power and purpose. The Lawndale attack was not an isolated incident. Just 1 year earlier, in 1976, South Texas experienced a wave of sightings that became known as the Big Bird Flap. Beginning in January and continuing through the spring, residents of small towns in the Rio Grande Valley reported encounters with a bird so large it seemed impossible. Witnesses in Harlingen, Brownsville, and San Benito described a creature standing between 4 and 5 feet tall, with a wingspan estimated between 15 and 20 feet. The bird was covered in dark feathers, had a gorilla-like face with a prominent beak, and moved with a strange combination of bird-like hopping and almost human-like purposefulness. Alvarico Guajardo, a resident of Brownsville, reported the creature landing on the roof of his mobile home, the impact so heavy it shook the entire structure. When he went outside to investigate, he found himself face to face with something that should not exist. The bird's head was level with his own. As he stood on the ground, looking up at it, perched on his roof. Its eyes, he said, were intelligent and aware in a way that went beyond animal cunning. It studied him for several long seconds before spreading wings that seemed to stretch forever and lifting off with powerful beats that he could feel as pressure waves against his chest. Police officer Arturo Padilla encountered the creature while on patrol one night and reported it in an official statement, lending law enforcement credibility to the sightings. He described the bird as having a face that looked more bat-like than avian, with a wide mouth and eyes that reflected red in his cruiser's headlights. The wingspan, he estimated conservatively, was at least 12 feet, though he believed it could have been significantly larger. What united all these modern sightings was the witnesses' absolute certainty that what they had seen was real, physical, and terrifying. These were not people predisposed to believing in cryptids or seeking attention. They were farmers, police officers, teachers, and parents who happened to witness something that violated their understanding of what was possible. The fear in their voices when recounting these encounters was genuine. They had looked up at the sky and seen something that reminded them, perhaps unconsciously, of those ancient Thunderbird legends, of a time when humans were not the undisputed masters of their environment, when something larger and more powerful could look down on us and see prey. The Arizona Territory in the year 1890 was still a place where the line between fact and fiction blurred like heat waves rising off the desert floor. Tombstone, that notorious mining town that had witnessed the gunfight at the OK Corral less than a decade earlier, was home to a newspaper that reflected the wild spirit of its era. The Tombstone epitaph had built its reputation on sensational stories that walked the razor edge between frontier journalism and outright fabrication. But in April of that year, the paper published something that would haunt researchers for over a century to come. The article described two ranchers who had encountered a massive winged creature in the desert between the Huachuca Mountains and the town itself. According to the report, these cowboys had spotted something enormous gliding through the sky, its wings stretching an impossible distance across the Arizona blue. The creature was described as resembling nothing so much as a pterodactyl, that ancient reptilian flyer that scientists had only recently pieced together from fossil remains. The ranchers, the story claimed, had pursued the beast on horseback and eventually brought it down with rifle fire. The description that followed read like something from a fever dream. The creature measured approximately 92 feet from wingtip to wingtip. Its body was smooth and featherless. The head was elongated, featuring a massive beak lined with sharp teeth. The wings were composed of a thick, leathery membrane similar to that of a bat but on a scale that defied comprehension. Now, on its surface, this reads like exactly the kind of tall tale that frontier newspapers love to print. The epitaph and papers like it regularly publish stories of giant snakes, desert monsters, and impossible creatures. These yarns sold papers in an era when entertainment was scarce and the boundaries of the known world still held genuine mystery. Editors understood that readers couldn't always distinguish between news reports and creative fiction, and many didn't particularly care to make that distinction. The wilder the story, the better it sold. But here's where the Tombstone pterodactyl story takes a turn that separates it from typical frontier nonsense. Beginning sometime in the 1960s, people began coming forward claiming they had seen a photograph that accompanied the original article. Not just one or two people, but dozens, then hundreds. These witnesses described the same image with remarkable consistency. The photograph showed the dead creature nailed or pinned to the side of a barn or wooden building. Its wings were spread wide in a display of its massive wingspan. 6 or 7 men stood in front of the creature, arms outstretched to give scale to the immense beast. The men were dressed in frontier clothing, suggesting the photograph was indeed from the 1890s era. These weren't fringe individuals making these claims. Credible researchers, writers, and ordinary people with no stake in perpetuating a hoax all insisted they had seen this photograph. Some claimed to have seen it in old books about unexplained phenomena. Others remembered it from magazines or documentary programs. A few even described the specific texture of the creature's skin in the photograph, the way its wing membranes caught the light, the expressions on the faces of the men standing before it. The details were too specific, too consistent to dismiss outright. Researchers began searching for this photograph in earnest. They combed through archives of the Tombstone epitaph, finding the original article but no accompanying image. They searched through collections of frontier photography, databases of historical newspapers, libraries specializing in Arizona territorial history. Nothing. The photograph, if it had ever existed, had vanished completely. No original print, no negative, no reproduction in any archive. It was as if the image had been systematically erased from the historical record. This is where we enter truly unsettling territory. The phenomenon has a name in psychology. Researchers call it the Mandela Effect, named after the widespread false memory of Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, rather than living to become president of South Africa and dying in 2013. It describes situations where large groups of people share the same incorrect memory, often with remarkable specificity. But the Thunderbird photograph represents something even stranger. These aren't vague recollections. These are detailed, consistent descriptions of a specific image that cannot be found anywhere in the documented historical record. So we're left with several possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Perhaps this is simply a case of mass misremembering, where people have conflated various images and created a false memory of something that never existed. But if that's true, what images did they conflate? What could produce such a specific, consistent false memory across so many different people? This brings us to the documented photographs of genuine giant bird. In the 1940s, California condors, those massive vultures with wingspans reaching nearly 10 feet, were photographed being captured by wildlife biologists. These images show large birds with impressive wingspans held or displayed by humans. The contrast between the enormous birds and the people provides exactly the kind of scale reference that witnesses describe in the Thunderbird photograph. But condors, even at their most impressive, don't approach the dimensions described in the phantom photograph. Victorian-era photography provides another piece of this puzzle. In the late 1800s, it became fashionable to photograph hunters with their kills, including large birds of prey. Golden eagles, condors, and other impressive raptors were displayed in ways that emphasized their size. Some of these photographs show birds nailed to barn walls with wings spread, a common method of displaying specimens. The similarity to the described Thunderbird photograph is unmistakable. But again, none of these images match the specific details that witnesses provide. Then we have the Argentavis magnificens, the largest flying bird ever discovered by science. This extinct species, which lived in Argentina roughly 6 million years ago, had an estimated wingspan of up to 23 feet. The fossils were discovered in the 1970s and 80s, long after the Tombstone article was published. Reconstructions and artist renderings of this magnificent creature appear in books about prehistoric life. Could people be remembering these reconstructions and mentally transplanting them into a vintage photograph format? The timeline doesn't quite work, but the human mind is capable of extraordinary feats of memory manipulation. But here's what keeps researchers awake at night. What if none of these explanations are correct? What if people are remembering an actual photograph of an actual creature that science says cannot exist? Consider the consistency of the reports. Different people, with no contact with each other, describing the same image in the same way. The barn wall, the spread wings, the frontier-dressed men, the sheer size of the creature. These details remain constant across hundreds of testimonies. Some researchers have proposed that the photograph might have been real, but depicted something other than what it appeared to show. Perhaps it was an elaborate hoax from the 1890s, a fabricated creature created for the camera. Frontier photographers were known to create fake images of giant vegetables, impossible hunting trophies, and other tall-tale subjects. The technology existed to create convincing fakes. But if such a hoax photograph existed, where is it now? Why would it disappear so completely? Others suggest the photograph might be real and hidden, suppressed by institutions that found it too problematic to acknowledge. This ventures into conspiracy territory, but it's worth noting that museums and scientific institutions have historically been reluctant to display or acknowledge artifacts that don't fit established paradigms. Could a photograph of an impossible creature have been quietly buried to avoid uncomfortable questions? The psychological dimension of this mystery cuts deep. Human memory is not a video recording. It's a reconstruction, assembled each time we recall it from fragments and suggestions. Memories can be contaminated by conversations, by seeing similar images, by wishful thinking, and the desire for mystery in a world increasingly devoid of it. When we remember something, we're not accessing a pristine recording, but rebuilding the memory from pieces that may have been altered, combined with other memories or influenced by information we encountered later. Yet the Thunderbird photograph witnesses aren't describing vague impressions. They're describing a specific image with specific details. Some can tell you where in a book they saw it, what page it was on, what the caption said. These are not the hallmarks of false memory. These are the characteristics of genuine recall, which leaves us in an impossible position. Either thousands of people are experiencing the same highly specific false memory, or they're remembering something real that has been erased from the historical record. The Tombstone epitaph article itself adds another layer of mystery. While frontier newspapers did publish tall tales, they typically framed them as entertainment or presented them with a wink and a nudge. The pterodactyl article was written in the straight reporting style used for actual news. No hedging language, no suggestion of uncertainty. Just the facts as presented by the ranchers. Does this mean the story was true? Not necessarily. But it does suggest the article was meant to be taken as a genuine report, not recognized fiction. What remains is an absence that somehow feels more present than many documented facts. The missing photograph has taken on a life of its own, becoming more real in the collective imagination than many images that actually exist. People continue searching for it, certain they've seen it, convinced it must be out there somewhere. And in that searching, in that certainty, we find something profound about human nature, and our relationship with the unknown. We want there to be mysteries. We want the world to still hold spaces where impossible things might lurk. The Thunderbird photograph, whether it ever existed or not, serves that deep psychological need. It represents the possibility that our world is stranger than we've been told, that creatures from legend might have left photographic evidence before vanishing forever. The question isn't just whether the photograph existed. It's what it means that so many of us desperately want it to have existed and insist in our memories that it did. The morning Sarah Chen found the photograph again, she made a decision that would change everything. She called her husband into the home office, pulled up the image on her laptop, and asked him to look carefully at what she was about to show him. The Tombstone Thunderbird photograph, that impossible image of 6 cowboys standing beneath a crucified pteranodon, filled the screen. Her husband studied it for several minutes while Sarah took photographs of the screen with her phone, saved the webpage to multiple devices, and even printed a physical copy. Then she closed her laptop and went to make coffee. When she returned 15 minutes later and opened the same browser window, the image was different. Not missing, different. The bird was smaller. The men were positioned differently. And when she checked her phone, her photographs showed the new version too. The printed copy in her hand matched her screen perfectly, but it was not what she had shown her husband a quarter hour before. This is where the Thunderbird photograph transcends mere mystery and enters truly unsettling territory. Because Sarah is not alone. She is one among thousands who report something far stranger than simply failing to find an old photograph. These people claim the photograph changes, that it disappears, that reality itself seems to shift around this single image like water flowing around a stone. The phenomenon has a name now. We call it the Mandela Effect, coined after the widespread false memory of Nelson Mandela dying in prison during the 1980s, when in reality he lived until 2013. The term describes collective false memories, those strange instances where large groups of people remember the same incorrect information with identical confidence and specificity. The Berenstain Bears spelled with an A, not an E, though thousands swear otherwise. The Monopoly Man never wore a monocle, despite countless confident memories. Darth Vader never said, "Luke, I am your father." The actual line is, "No, I am your father." Memory researchers have documented these mass confabulations extensively. Dr. Elizabeth Loftus of the University of California, Irvine, has spent decades demonstrating how easily human memory can be manipulated and contaminated. In her landmark studies, she successfully implanted false childhood memories in research subjects, convincing them they had been lost in shopping malls or had witnessed events that never occurred. Her work reveals memory not as a recording device, but as a reconstruction, rebuilt each time we access it, vulnerable to suggestion, social reinforcement, and our own expectations. Dr. Henry Roediger at Washington University in St. Louis has explored the social contagion of false memories. When people discuss shared experiences, their individual memories merge and contaminate each other, creating collective narratives that may bear little resemblance to actual events. One person's confident but incorrect recollection can overwrite the uncertain memories of others, spreading like a virus through social networks until an entire group shares the same false memory. These explanations work perfectly for most Mandela Effect examples. We confuse the Berenstain Bears spelling because our minds expect the more common Stein ending. We add a monocle to the Monopoly Man because we conflate him with other wealthy character archetypes like Mr. Peanut, who actually does wear one. Our brains fill gaps with plausible details drawn from cultural expectations and similar memories. But the Thunderbird photograph presents a problem that makes researchers uncomfortable, because the memories surrounding this image do not follow typical false memory patterns. False memories, even collective ones, tend to be vague. They involve general impressions, fuzzy details, and information that could plausibly have been constructed from cultural knowledge and social suggestion. The Thunderbird memories are different. They are precise, specific, and detailed in ways that challenge standard psychological explanations. Witness after witness describes not just seeing the photograph, but exactly where they saw it. Margaret Hollis, a retired high school librarian from Kansas, claims she filed and refiled the image dozens of times over a 3-year period in the mid-1990s. It appeared, according to her detailed recollection, in a large format book about American cryptozoology, on page 147, in the lower right corner. She remembers this specifically because the page number stuck in her mind, matching her grandmother's house address. She remembers the caption beneath the photograph, which read "Thunderbird killed near Tombstone, Arizona, 1890. She remembers students requesting that specific book to see that specific photograph for research papers and projects. When pressed about the possibility of false memory, Margaret becomes frustrated. This was not a single viewing from childhood, contaminated by decades of misremembering. This was part of her job, repeated exposure in a professional context, recent enough that her memory should be reliable. She has searched for that book in the years since. It is not in the library's catalog. It is not in the donation records. According to official documentation, it never existed. Patrick Huey, a science journalist and cryptozoology researcher, describes a similarly specific memory. He saw the Thunderbird photograph in the late 1970s while researching a book on unexplained phenomena. He saw it in the archives of Fate magazine, in an issue from the 1960s, though he cannot recall the exact year. He remembers the photograph was reproduced in black and white, slightly grainy from the printing process, and accompanied by a short article describing the creature's capture. He took notes on the article, notes he still possesses, referencing a photograph that, according to Fate magazine's complete archives, has never appeared in their publication. These are not vague childhood impressions. These are professional researchers and librarians claiming recent, work-related encounters with source materials they should be able to relocate. The specificity is unnerving. In typical false memory cases, details become fuzzier under scrutiny. Here, witnesses often become more specific, adding details about surrounding text, page numbers, and contextual information that suggests genuine memory rather than confabulation. Then, there is John Keel. Keel remains one of the most important figures in American paranormal research. His book, The Mothman Prophecies, became a cultural touchstone, but his work ranged across the entire spectrum of unexplained phenomena. He investigated UFOs, cryptids, and high strangeness for over 4 decades, maintaining detailed files and extensive archives. Keel was methodical, careful, and deeply skeptical of extraordinary claims. He demanded evidence, which is why his statements about the Thunderbird photograph carry such weight. Keel asserted repeatedly, in multiple interviews and written correspondence, that he had seen the photograph. Not once, but multiple times, in different sources over the years. He described it in terms matching the common description: 6 men, Old West clothing, a massive bird-like creature with leathery wings spread wide, pinned to a barn wall. He claimed he had seen it in old newspapers during his research, and that he had even held a physical copy at one point. But he could never find it again. This frustration permeates Keel's later writing on the subject. Here was a man who had spent his professional life tracking down obscure sources, verifying accounts, and documenting evidence. He knew how to research. He knew how to find things. Yet this photograph eluded him completely. In his final years, Keel seemed to view the missing Thunderbird photo as a personal failure, a gap in his otherwise meticulous documentation. The most disturbing accounts, however, come from people who claimed they did not just see the photograph, but watched it disappear. Robert Michaels from Oregon describes showing the photograph to his teenage daughter in 2008. He had found it online after years of searching, a clear high-resolution scan on a historical website dedicated to Arizona history. He called his daughter over, told her about the old mystery, and showed her the image. They discussed it for several minutes, zooming in on details, examining the men's faces and the creature's anatomy. His daughter suggested they print it to show her history teacher. Robert clicked the print button. An error message appeared. He refreshed the page. The image was different. Smaller, less clear, and when he looked closely, not the same photograph at all. It showed men with a large bird, but a condor or oversized eagle, not a pteranodon. The URL was the same. The page layout was the same. But the photograph had changed in the seconds between viewing and printing. His daughter remembers the original version. They both do. But it no longer exists anywhere they can find it. Alice Summers describes a similar experience with a physical book. In 1993, she found the photograph in her college library, in a book about Western American folklore. She was writing a paper on cryptozoology and oral tradition. She marked the page with a sticky note and checked the book out for 2 weeks. Over the following days, she showed the photograph to her roommate, her boyfriend, and her study group. All of them remember seeing it. On the day her paper was due, she returned to the book to cite her source properly. The photograph was not there. The page was different. The text continued without interruption, where the image should have been. Her sticky note marked a page about cattle mutilations, not thunderbirds. According to the table of contents, the book contained no chapter on giant bird sightings at all. Or other people remember seeing that photograph in that book. The book's current edition, which the library confirms is identical to the 1993 printing, contains no such image. These accounts accumulate. Dozens become hundreds. Online forums dedicated to the Mandela Effect overflow with Thunderbird testimonies. The details overlap in unsettling ways. The number of men varies between 6 and 7. The setting is always southwestern, usually Arizona, often specifically Tombstone. The date hovers around the 1880s or 90s. The bird is always large, always pinned or crucified, always displayed like a hunting trophy. Psychologists attempting to explain this point to social contagion and internet echo chambers. Once a few people describe a false memory publicly, others incorporate those details into their own vague recollections, creating an illusion of independent verification. The internet allows false memories to spread and reinforce globally, creating unprecedented levels of collective confabulation. But this explanation requires us to believe that thousands of people, many claiming vivid, specific memories from before internet forums existed, have all spontaneously created identical false memories of a photograph that perfectly matches descriptions from the 1800s. It requires us to believe that professional librarians and researchers, trained to document sources and verify information, have all made the same professional error in the same specific way. It requires us to believe that John Keel, one of the most meticulous researchers in paranormal investigation, somehow convinced himself he had seen something he never saw, and then spent years searching for it, despite his own expertise in separating memory from evidence. The alternative is more disturbing. What if memory is not the problem? What if the photograph exists in some sources at some times for some people, but not consistently? What if reality itself is less stable than we assume? Quantum physics has demonstrated that observation affects reality at the subatomic level. The observer effect shows particles behaving differently when measured than when unobserved. Some interpretations suggest multiple realities might exist simultaneously, with consciousness collapsing probability waves into singular experienced events. What if that collapse is not permanent? What if reality is more fluid, more mutable than our everyday experience suggests? The Thunderbird photograph may represent a crack in that stability. A point where something slips between different versions of events, different configurations of historical record. The people who remember it may not be confabulate. They may be remembering accurately, but from a slightly different version of reality than the one they currently inhabit. This is, of course, impossible. It violates everything we know about physics, causality, and the nature of existence itself. It is far more reasonable to accept that thousands of people are mistaken, that their memories are false, that the entire phenomenon results from known psychological processes amplified by social media and cultural fascination with mysteries. But late at night, when you are alone with your thoughts, consider this. What do you remember that you can no longer prove? What certainties rest in your mind without supporting evidence? And if you found that evidence tomorrow, showed it to someone, and then watched it change before your eyes, would you trust reality or your memory? The Thunderbird photograph asks us to choose. Either our minds are far more fallible than we want to believe, or the world is far stranger than we dare to accept. Neither answer brings comfort. And somewhere maybe, in some version of events we can no longer access, 6 cowboys stand proudly beneath an impossible creature. Proof that the world once contained wonders we can now only remember like fading dreams. The photograph has haunted American folklore for more than a century, described in vivid detail by countless witnesses yet remaining frustratingly beyond reach. Those who claim to have seen it speak with remarkable consistency about the image, a Civil War-era photograph supposedly showing 6 soldiers standing beside an enormous bird, crucified against a barn wall with wings spread impossibly wide. The men in the picture appear dwarfed by the creature, their faces bearing expressions that witnesses describe as a mixture of pride and unease, hunters who have brought down something they perhaps should have left alone. The most persistent connection to this legendary photograph comes from the Fremont expeditions of the mid-1800s. John Charles Fremont, explorer and military officer, led several surveying expeditions through the American West between 1842 and 1854. His teams documented the landscape through sketches and, in later expeditions, the revolutionary new medium of photography. Researchers who claim familiarity with the Thunderbird photograph insist it originated from one of these expeditions, captured during the exploration of the Southwest Territories where Native American legends of enormous birds ran deepest. They describe the barn in the background as a crude frontier structure, the kind of rough-hewn building that would have been common in newly settled territories during that era. Yet despite decades of searching through Civil War archives, Fremont expedition records, and private collections of 19th century photography, no researcher has ever produced the actual image. The photograph exists in a strange liminal space, remembered by many but possessed by none. Those who claim to have seen it can describe it with startling precision, down to the grain of the wood on a barn wall and the style of uniforms worn by the soldiers. But when pressed to produce the image or identify where they saw it, memories become uncertain, details shift like sand, and the photograph retreats once more into legend. This phenomenon took a tantalizing turn in 2002, when a man from California contacted several cryptozoology researchers with an extraordinary claim. He said his name was Thomas, though he requested his surname remain private, and he'd been sorting through belongings left behind by his recently deceased grandfather. Among boxes of old letters and faded documents, he discovered what appeared to be the legendary photograph. According to Thomas, the image showed exactly what folklore had always described: 6 men in period clothing, standing beside a massive bird-like creature pinned to a wall, its wings stretched to an impossible span. Thomas contacted researchers immediately, describing his find in detail. The photograph was mounted on thick cardstock typical of 19th century studio photography. The image quality suggested early wet plate collodion processing, consistent with 1860s era techniques. The creature itself appeared reptilian in certain features, with a head that seemed disproportionately large and a beak that witnesses of modern sightings might describe as more of a pointed snout. Thomas promised to scan the photograph at high resolution and share it with the cryptozoological community. He scheduled the scanning for 3 days after his initial contact. The photograph vanished before he could complete that task. Thomas's account of the disappearance carries an unsettling quality that has only deepened the mystery surrounding the image. He claimed to have placed the photograph in a desk drawer in his home office, separate from the other items in his grandfather's collection. He checked on it the morning before his planned trip to a professional scanning service. The photograph was there. He locked his house when he left for work that day, returning home 7 hours later to find everything apparently undisturbed. No signs of break-in, no indication that anyone had entered the property. The desk drawer sat exactly as he had left it, but the photograph was gone. In the weeks that followed, Thomas reported experiencing what he described as a profound sense of being watched. Shadows seemed to move in his peripheral vision. He would wake in the night convinced someone stood at the foot of his bed, though nothing was ever there when he turned on the lights. After 6 weeks of escalating unease, Thomas moved from his home and ceased all communication with researchers. Multiple investigators have attempted to locate him in the years since, but Thomas appears to have vanished as completely as the photograph itself. Skeptics suggest Thomas fabricated the entire story, either for attention or as part of an elaborate hoax. But those who spoke with him during those brief weeks in 2002 describe a man who sounded genuinely disturbed, not excited or attention-seeking. His reluctance to use his full name, they argue, suggests someone who wished he had never found the photograph at all, not someone seeking fame from a hoax. The Thomas incident exemplifies the curse that seems to follow Thunderbird photographic evidence into the modern era. Despite living in an age where nearly everyone carries a high-resolution camera in their pocket, clear photographs of these creatures remain stubbornly elusive. The images that do surface share a common quality of frustrating ambiguity, just detailed enough to intrigue but never clear enough to convince. In 2017, a property owner in central Idaho named Marcus Webb set up a network of trail cameras on his land after repeatedly finding the carcasses of deer that had been torn apart in ways inconsistent with known predators. The wounds suggested something with enormous talons had gripped the animals from above, crushing their rib cages before feeding. Webb positioned 6 cameras across a meadow where several of these kills had occurred, hoping to identify the predator. On October morning, one camera triggered. The image it captured has circulated through cryptozoology circles ever since, analyzed and debated with intensity. The photograph shows something massive and dark against an early morning sky, wings spread in a glide pattern above the meadow. The creature appears to have a wingspan approaching 20 feet, with a body structure unlike any known bird of prey in North America. But the image suffers from motion blur and awkward framing, the creature positioned at the extreme edge of the camera's field of view. Enhancement attempts have yielded only more questions. Some analysts insist they can detect a reptilian texture to the wings, while others argue the image shows nothing more than a turkey vulture caught at an unusual angle with distorted perspective, creating the illusion of enormous size. Webb himself refuses to dismiss what his camera captured. He notes that in the weeks following the photograph, the deer killings on his property stopped completely. Whatever had been hunting there moved on, as if aware it had been documented. The other 5 cameras, positioned to cover overlapping fields of view, recorded nothing during the same time period. Only the single camera caught the image, and only for a single frame. The following year brought another tantalizing piece of evidence from Alaska. A fishing guide named Sarah Chen was leading clients on the Kenai Peninsula in August of 2018, when something massive flew over their boat. Chen grabbed her smartphone and managed to capture approximately 12 seconds of video footage before the creature disappeared behind a ridgeline. The video shows a dark shape moving against low clouds, wings beating in a pattern Chen describes as ponderous and powerful, more like a pterosaur in documentaries than any modern bird. But like the Idaho Trail camera image, the Alaska footage frustrates as much as it intrigues. The distance between Chen's boat and the creature leaves it as little more than a dark silhouette. Smartphone cameras in 2018, despite their advancing technology, still struggled with distant subjects and rapid focus changes. The video shifts between relative clarity and complete blur as Chen's phone attempts to track the moving object. Analysis of the footage confirms something was present in the sky, something large enough to be visible at considerable distance. But definitive identification remains impossible. Chen's clients corroborated her sighting, all 5 witnesses agreeing they saw something they could not identify, something far larger than any eagle or known bird of prey. One client, a retired Air Force pilot named Donald Green, estimated the wingspan at no less than 18 feet based on his experience judging aircraft dimensions. Green noted that the wing beat pattern seemed wrong for any bird he had encountered, describing it as almost labored, as if the creature was struggling with its own enormous mass. This pattern repeats across modern sighting reports. People capture images, but the images never quite achieve the clarity needed for definitive proof. Wildlife cameras trigger at the wrong moment or from the wrong angle. Smartphones blur at the critical instant. Even dedicated photography attempts seem cursed by technical failures and impossible timing issues. In 2019, a group of cryptozoology enthusiasts conducted a 2-week expedition through southern Arizona specifically seeking thunderbird photographs. They brought professional camera equipment, telephoto lenses, and high-speed video cameras. They positioned themselves at locations where sightings had been reported with unusual frequency. In 14 days of intensive searching, they photographed golden eagles, turkey vultures, and various hawks. They documented the landscape and interviewed local witnesses, but they captured not a single image of anything anomalous. On the day they departed, a rancher 15 miles from their final search location reported seeing an enormous bird-like creature carrying off a calf. The expedition members were already driving home when the sighting occurred. This phenomenon has led some researchers to propose an unsettling theory that something about these creatures prevents their documentation. Perhaps they possess a heightened sensitivity to observation, avoiding areas where cameras are present. Perhaps something more inexplicable is at work, some quality that causes technology to fail at critical moments or prevents humans from being in the right place at the right time. The paranoia builds from this idea, the suggestion that we are dealing with creatures possessing an almost supernatural awareness of human attempts to capture their image. Dr. Ellen Morrison, a wildlife biologist specializing in raptor populations, has reviewed numerous Thunderbird reports and finds herself in the uncomfortable position of acknowledging biological impossibilities. In a 2020 interview, she stated that several sighting reports describe wingspans that exceed what physics and biology would permit for a flying creature on Earth. Birds with wingspans approaching 25 or 30 feet, as some witnesses claim, would face insurmountable challenges related to weight, muscle power, and bone structure. Such creatures could not generate sufficient lift under known atmospheric conditions, nor could their bodies support the muscular development required for sustained flight. Yet Morrison also admits that witness descriptions often come from people with legitimate expertise in identifying wildlife. Park rangers, hunters, pilots, and outdoor professionals have reported these sightings. These are not typically people prone to misidentifying common birds or exaggerating what they see. When a commercial pilot with 20 years of experience reports seeing something with a wingspan twice that of any known bird, Morrison suggests researchers must take that testimony seriously, even when it contradicts biological possibility. Other experts have noted similar contradictions. Dr. James Kellerman, an ornithologist who has spent 40 years studying birds of prey, reviewed video footage and photographs from multiple Thunderbird incidents. His conclusion, delivered with obvious reluctance, was that some of the reported creatures cannot be explained as known species. The proportions are wrong, the flight characteristics don't match any cataloged bird, and the sizes reported by credible witnesses exceed biological limits. Kellerman stops short of confirming that something unknown is flying through American skies, but he acknowledges that the evidence suggests possibilities science has not yet addressed. The photographs that don't exist continue to haunt us, more powerful in their absence than they might ever be if finally revealed. The legendary Civil War image remains lost, described but never found. Thomas's grandfather's photograph vanished into impossible circumstances. Modern attempts yield only frustration and blur. We live in an era of unprecedented documentation, where billions of images are captured every day, yet these creatures remain photographic ghosts, present in testimony and memory, but absent from definitive proof. The cameras fail, the images disappear, and the Thunderbirds continue their flight through the margins of visibility, just beyond the lens. When Marcus Treadwell uploaded his digitally reconstructed image in 2016, he believed he had solved the mystery. A research psychologist specializing in collective memory, Treadwell had spent 8 months compiling descriptions from over 3,000 people who claimed to remember the photograph. The consistency was remarkable. Everyone described the same composition: the creature standing at the forest edge, the impossibly long arms, the way it seemed to be turning toward the camera, the peculiar texture of its skin that looked both rough and slick simultaneously, the background that felt wrong somehow, too dark for midday, too light for dusk. Treadwell used cutting-edge digital rendering software to build the image pixel by pixel, incorporating every detail that appeared in more than 70% of witness accounts. He worked with cognitive scientists and visual artists. He consulted with cryptozoologists and photographers. The final image was technically perfect. It matched the collective description with uncanny precision. The response should have vindicated his work. Instead, it created something far more disturbing. Within hours of posting the recreation, his inbox flooded with messages. Thousands of them. And they all said essentially the same thing. That's it, but not quite. Close, but something's wrong. Almost right, but fundamentally incorrect in a way I can't explain. The comments were remarkably specific in their vagueness. One woman wrote that the creature's proportions were correct, but the feeling was absent. A man insisted the composition was perfect, but the atmosphere was completely different. Another claimed that looking at Treadwell's version made her uncomfortable, while the original had made her feel a creeping sense of dread that this recreation utterly failed to capture. Dozens reported that the digital image looked too clean, too obviously constructed, while the memory of the original felt organic and real and terrifyingly authentic. Treadwell himself admitted in a follow-up post that something troubled him about his own creation. He had built it according to specifications. He had matched every detail. Yet, when he looked at the finished product, he felt nothing. The image that thousands claimed to remember had reportedly induced genuine fear. His version, despite being technically identical, felt empty, hollow, like a perfect replica of something that had lost its soul in translation. This phenomenon of uncanny wrongness has plagued every attempted recreation. The Hoax Films production team encountered it while developing their mockumentary about the photograph in 2018. Director Sarah Vespucci became obsessed with getting the image right. She hired creature effects specialists who had worked on major Hollywood productions. They built practical models and digital assets. They studied eyewitness descriptions and compared notes with Treadwell. They shot in forests across 3 different states, trying to match the mysterious background setting that people remembered but couldn't quite place. Vespucci showed test versions to focus groups that included people who claimed to remember the original photograph. The response was always the same. The teeth are wrong. The eyes are too high. The arms are close, but the hands aren't quite right. The background needs to be darker. No, lighter. The trees are the wrong type. Actually, the trees are correct, but they're positioned incorrectly. You captured the stance, but missed the posture. One of her test subjects, a man named Robert Channing, became visibly distressed during the screening. He claimed the recreation was making him remember details about the original that he had forgotten. Details that contradicted other details he had previously been certain about. He described experiencing a sensation he called memory fracture, where trying to compare the recreation with his recollection caused his mental image to splinter and reform in conflicting ways. He left the screening early and later sent Vespucci an email asking her to remove him from all future sessions. He said continuing to look at attempted recreations was damaging his memory of the original, replacing something real with something artificial. Vespucci ultimately abandoned trying to perfectly recreate the photograph for her film. She told an interviewer that the process had become psychologically disturbing for everyone involved. Her effects team reported feeling watched while building the creature models. Her cinematographer claimed he kept seeing movement in his peripheral vision during forest shoot. Vespucci herself described experiencing vivid nightmares where she was looking at the real photograph, finally seeing it clearly, only to have it dissolve into static the moment she tried to focus on any specific detail. The Hoax Films experience is not unique. Independent researchers and curious artists have attempted dozens of recreations over the years. All report the same essential failure. They can get close, but never quite right. More disturbingly, many describe unusual experiences during their recreation attempts. Equipment malfunctions, unexplained audio on recordings, feelings of being observed. Several have abandoned their projects citing undefined discomfort or explicit fear. This is where the theories turn dark, where rational explanation gives way to possibilities that challenge our understanding of reality itself. Some researchers believe the wrongness we feel when viewing recreations is evidence that we are remembering something genuine, something that has been deliberately removed from our accessible reality. The recreations feel wrong because they are wrong. They are approximations of something real that we can no longer access. The government conspiracy theory has substantial following among investigators. This version suggests the photograph documented something that proved the existence of unidentified cryptids. Perhaps it provided clear evidence of a creature that should not exist according to accepted biology. Perhaps the creature in the image represented something so scientifically significant that its existence would disrupt established paradigms. Those who support this theory point to the reported men in suits who allegedly visited early forums discussing the photograph. They highlight the accounts of websites that mysteriously went offline after hosting analysis of the image. They cite the researcher who claims government agents interviewed him about his investigation, though he has never provided verifiable documentation of this encounter. Then there are the timeline theories. These propose something even more unsettling. What if the photograph existed in a slightly different version of reality? What if we are remembering something from a timeline that has shifted or split or been overwritten? According to this interpretation, The recreations feel wrong because they are being constructed in the wrong reality. We remember something from elsewhere, from a world that ran parallel to this one, until some divergence point erased or altered certain elements. The photograph was one of those elements. We retained the memory, but lost access to the actual image. This theory finds support among those who report experiencing the Mandela Effect, where large groups of people share false memories of events or details that apparently never existed. The missing photograph becomes the ultimate Mandela Effect, a collective memory of something thousands of people can describe in detail, but which has left no physical trace. Proponents point to the consistency of descriptions as evidence against simple false memory. They argue that false memories should vary more widely, that individual confabulation should produce greater discrepancies. The fact that so many people remember the same impossible image suggests they are accessing a genuine shared memory of something that was real in some version of our reality. But the darkest theory, the one that keeps investigators awake at night, is that something deliberately removed the photograph. Not government agents, not timeline shifts, something else. Something that became aware it had been captured on film and took steps to erase the evidence. This theory suggests an intelligence behind the disappearance, a purposeful action by the subject of the photograph itself or by forces acting on its behalf. Those who propose this theory point to the warnings. There are scattered but persistent reports of people being told to stop searching. A researcher named Catherine Wells claims she received an anonymous phone call after posting about the photograph on a paranormal investigation forum. The caller, whose voice she described as neither clearly male nor female, told her that some things prefer to remain unverified, that continued searching would bring consequences. Wells initially dismissed the call as a prank. Then, her computer hard drive failed, destroying years of research. Her backup drives corrupted simultaneously. She describes it as statistically impossible. She stopped investigating. Others report similar experiences. Vehicles breaking down on roads leading to locations where people claimed to have first seen the photograph. Electronics malfunctioning during research sessions. Unusual sounds in homes after particularly intensive investigation periods. Dreams where something tall and wrong stands at the foot of the bed, watching silently. Several investigators describe an escalating sense of dread that intensified the deeper they searched, a feeling that they were approaching something that should not be approached. A man who identified himself only as Marcus B. posted to a forum in 2019, claiming he had found the original photograph. He provided no image, no proof, only a description of what he had allegedly discovered. According to his post, the photograph was worse than people remembered. The creature was looking directly at the camera. You could see intelligence in its eyes. Malevolent intelligence. He claimed he understood immediately why the image had been removed. Some things should not be seen. Some evidence should not exist. He wrote that he had destroyed the copy he found and urged others to stop searching. He never posted again. Attempts to contact him through the forum account failed. The recreation attempts continued despite these warnings. Artists and researchers still try to construct the image everyone remembers. But each attempt reinforces the central mystery. Why can we describe it, but never recreate it accurately? Why does every version feel wrong, even when it matches our descriptions? What does it mean that our collective memory holds something that apparently cannot exist in our current reality? When we create what we remember and it feels incorrect, we are forced to confront an unsettling possibility. Either our memories are false, shared delusions built from suggestion and collective confabulation, or our memories are real and something has removed the evidence they reference. Both options are deeply troubling, but the second option, the one that suggests deliberate erasure, carries implications that extend far beyond a single missing photograph. It suggests that our reality can be edited, that evidence can be removed retroactively, that what we remember may be more real than what we can currently access. The evidence stretches across more than a century, a web of testimonies so vast and so consistent that dismissing it becomes harder than believing. Thousands of people from Illinois to Texas, from the 1800s to last Tuesday, have looked up and seen something that should not exist. Giant birds with wingspans that blot out the sun. Creatures from another age, or perhaps another reality entirely, gliding through our skies as if the veil between worlds has worn dangerously thin. The Native American prophecies speak of the Thunderbirds returning, ancient beings of power and omen who disappeared when the world grew too loud, too small for their kind. Elders whispered that when the earth tips toward chaos, when humanity forgets how to listen, the Thunderbirds would come back. And now, in our fractured modern world, the sightings accelerate. People from every walk of life, people who have nothing to gain from ridicule, report the same impossible thing. Yet we have nothing. No photograph that can be verified. No physical evidence that survives scrutiny. And most haunting of all, we have that photograph, the one seared into thousands of memories with perfect clarity. The birds spread across a barn wall, the men standing beneath it in their overalls and work shirts, the distinct grain of the wood behind the creature's massive wings. Everyone remembers the magazine, the exact page, the caption underneath. But when we reach for it, our hands close on emptiness. Why this specific photograph? What makes this particular image lodge so deeply in our collective consciousness that people stake their sanity on having seen it? The memories are too detailed, too consistent to be simple confusion. They describe the same barn, the same pose, the same unsettling proportions. Some remember it from old copies of National Geographic. Others swear it was Fate magazine, or some forgotten pulp publication from the 1960s. The certainty is absolute. The evidence is absent. The institutional claims make it worse. Newspapers that should have archives cannot find them. Museums that supposedly displayed the photograph have no record of ever possessing it. Libraries where people studied the image for school reports have no trace of the publication. It is as if something reached back through time and carefully erased every physical copy while leaving the memory intact. A ghost print on our collective mind. We circle back to the same three possibilities, each one more disturbing than comfortable skepticism allows. Perhaps the photograph existed and was systematically destroyed, removed by someone or something that understood its power. Perhaps it exists in a reality that has shifted away from us, a timeline we remember but can no longer touch. Or perhaps something wants us to forget, and the memory itself is the last ember of resistance against an enforced blindness. Meanwhile, the giant birds continue. They appear over highways in broad daylight. They chase small planes through empty skies. They perch on water towers and barn roofs, watching the people below with eyes that seem to recognize us. The sightings follow patterns too deliberate to ignore. Clusters appear around ancient sites. Reports spike during periods of social upheaval. Witnesses describe not just seeing the creatures, but feeling seen by them, observed by an intelligence that predates our maps and our certainties. The search continues because it must. People cannot unsee what lives in their memories. They cannot unfeel the conviction that once, somewhere, proof existed. And so they dig through attic boxes and estate sales. They scroll through digitized archives and faded microfiche. They join online groups where others share the same impossible memory, the same frustration, the same growing certainty that something fundamental about our reality does not add up. The gap between memory and reality yawns wider with each passing year. How many of us remember things that leave no trace? How many certainties dissolve when we reach for confirmation? This photograph has become a symbol of a larger unraveling, the sense that the world we think we know and the world that actually exists may not be the same place. And still they fly. Still people look up and see wings that dwarf eagles, bodies too large for aerodynamics, creatures that should not be possible, yet cast very real shadows on very real ground. Still they search for the photograph that everyone has seen but no one can find. We may never know the truth. The answer may live in a space between what we remember and what we can prove, in that uncomfortable territory where certainty meets void. Perhaps we are not meant to know. Perhaps the mystery itself serves a purpose we cannot yet understand. But somewhere, in a barn we can no longer find, a creature we're not supposed to remember hangs waiting to be photographed again. Or, perhaps, it's watching us search. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.